All right. I forgot. Yes, I forgot to record. Okay. Once again, a couple of weeks ago, I posted these 4 questions, and we were supposed to go through them last week, but cities. So we'll go through them this week, and hopefully, you and I are all on the same. Uh, you and I are on the same page on these things. Okay. Let's move on. Now, first question, or do you think that land use affects land value? Um, how does one influence the other? Um, Before I go into that, I'd like to remind everyone of something that you might have learned last year, or in your first semester, during the introduction to urban and regional planning class. Now, um, we need you may remember from the introductory course that planning is in essence an intervention. Um, on one hand, you have steady, if not rapid, growth of population, while on the other hand, you have a limited supply of land. Now, planning as an intervention measure tries to ensure the allocation of resources to support human activities. And one of the many ways spatial planning achieve this is through land use planning. Land use planning is one of many intervention strategies in line with spatial planning. It's a way to ensure equal access to resources such as healthcare, housing, education, employment, and other opportunities. So from there, in a way, there is a sense that, okay, there may be a connection between land use and land value, because although all land, in my opinion, is created equal, but what we designate the land use as will eventually affect this land value, as you guys have mentioned in your video responses. Now, I'll leave that for the moment. And I'll leave that for the moment. And in short, the answer to the first question is yes. And why? Well, there are many reasons. There are many reasons for that. But we'll hopefully dwell into that a little later. Moving on to the next question. Factors affecting land value. Now, Pak Ardi and I co-wrote a conference paper presenting our research findings quite a while ago, 2012, called Impact of Residential Development Towards Land Price Dynamics in Surabaya. And we presented this paper at the 11th Indonesian Regional Sciences Association Congress. And to date, this paper has been cited by both Indonesian and international researchers. And from that research, we learned that there are several factors that affect land value, and you can see that Pak Ardi and I, we explicitly mentioned in our paper that land value or property value is affected by economic factors. Then there are social aspects that we need to consider, legal aspects such as land status, the legality of things, and then of course the regulatory framework and the regulatory or political landscape for that time. And then there are built environment aspects such as infrastructure and all that. And then what's interesting is that the sixth factor that we discovered was, or that we uncovered, not discovered, uncovered, was developers' reputation. So apparently, but as I mentioned before, our research looked into residential development. So keep in mind that these findings, that these factors were from a research that focused on property development. And so these factors are the result of a what was that word that I was looking for? Well, the result of a research focusing on property development. So again, there are other things that we mentioned, although not explicitly, things like accessibility and distance. I'd like to leave this open for further discussion for the time being, especially the other things that are accessibility and distance, because there are multiple theories and multiple theories that highlight the effect of distance towards land price and land value. I was hoping to get Pak Rudi to join us today, but unfortunately he had to attend a training of some sort, so he couldn't make it to the discussion today. But hopefully I can get him to provide some insights to this phenomenon, so to say. Okay. Now, planning, as I mentioned, is an intervention, and it's done by public authorities. Now, this question, the third question, whether land use classification should be done by the central government or the municipal, or at the municipal level, sorry, generated a lot of interesting responses. I can safely say that the majority of you, that most of you agree that land use classification should be done at the municipal level. Only a few actually mentioned that no, land use classification should be done by the central government. So this question somehow ties in with the fourth question. And so over the next few slides, I will try and tie these two questions together and answer them at the same time, or killing two birds with one stone, so to say. Now, I'd like to turn your attention to the foundation of spatial planning in Indonesia, our own Planning Act of 2007, or as you might know it as Undang-Undang Republik Indonesia Nomor 26 Tahun 2007 tentang Penataan Ruang. So it's a mouthful to say. From this point onwards, I will just call it the Planning Act 2007. Now, in terms of land use classification, the Planning Act, or the Act, states that spatial plans are classified according to the system, or the spatial system, according to its primary function, according to administrative orders, the primary activities, or the form, bentuk aktivitas, bentuk kegiatan, the form, the type of activity, and the strategic value. Now, if you have a copy of this Planning Act, then you can check Chapter 3, verse, chapter 3, verse 4, it explicitly states that spatial plans are classified according to those that I've mentioned. And these classifications result in several sub-classifications. From the primary system or primary spatial system, you have the regional and the internal urban system. And then from the primary functions, you have conservation and cultivation, or in our language, conservation would be kawasan lindung and cultivation would be kawasan budidaya. And then according to the administrative borders or the administrative scale, we have classifications at the national, regional, and then from the regional, it comes down to provincial, and then to the regency or city level, and so on and so forth. And primary activity or forms of activity, there are two sub-classifications, urban and rural areas. And then in terms of strategic value, there's only three sub-classification, national, provincial, and regency or city, kabupaten atau kota. Now, you might be thinking, but the question was about land use classification. And yes, you're right. My question was about land use classification. And as I mentioned, most of you responded that land use classification should be done at the municipal level, at the local level. And that I received some responses that mention about classifications done by the central government. Well, if you look at chapter 3, verses 4 and 5 in the Planning Act, it's clearly stated that there is a central classification of space. However, these classifications that you see before you are fairly broad, and they don't designate or refer to specific land usage. So there is a slight chance that although this points to a central government designation of land use classifications, there is still a chance that it is done at the municipal level. So but that doesn't fully answer the question, does it? And so in order to fully answer the question, in order to fully understand the question, we need to have a look at the planning system or the spatial planning system that we have to regulate land use. Now, I strongly believe that some, or if not all of you, are quite familiar with this diagram. I think you might have come across this diagram in the first semester, Introduction to Planning. And so I'm displaying this to remind us of the spatial planning system that we have in place. If you look from the left-hand side to your screen to the right-hand side, the scope changes from a very macro scale to a more micro scale. And if you look at this diagram from top to bottom, the geographical scale also shifts the same way from a larger scale national to a more local scale. And from this diagram, I reckon that you can kind of guess who does what, who is responsible for what section of the spatial planning system. For example, for development plans, you have RPJP, Rencana Pembangunan Jangka Panjang, or long-term development plans, or national long-term development plans. And then you have national midterm development plans. Those are done by the national government or by the central government. And then below the RPJP and RPJM, you have below the RPJPN and RPJMN, you have the provincial development, both long-term and short, not short, mid-term plans. And so these are done by the provincial government. So you can see the national, there's a national level, there's a provincial level, and then there's the local levels. But that's from the development plan side. These development plans are then translated into a more general spatial plan. So national spatial plans, provincial spatial plans, and then and urban and regional spatial plans. And these plans will be more further elaborated in a more detailed in more detailed documents. I think, yeah, well, I think all of you are pretty familiar with these, and I'm just bringing it up to try and tie in the third and the fourth question that I posted. So that brings then to what is our approach to planning. I gave you a few references on prescriptive and performance-based planning approaches to spatial planning. And so, what is our response? What is our approach? And I guess most, if not all of you, are correct in that sense, in the sense that we are using a cookie cutter approach, zoning, to regulate and to plan our territories. It's popped up, so I might remind you, those of you who are late to join, here's the QR code for to fill out your attendance for this session. If you're having problems with the QR code now, it'll pop up again later on during the session. Now let's have a look. Let's have a look at the different land use planning approaches. Now, it's very it's a very broad. I'm using two very broad terms to describe different land use planning approaches: prescriptive and performance-based. And I'm using the term prescriptive land use planning or prescriptive planning to describe any land use planning system that divides the territory of a municipality into functional districts. Other known terms for prescriptive planning are Euclidean zoning, named after the city of Euclid, who arguably was the first to apply such approach. Prescriptive planning is also known as conventional zoning or traditional zoning. And this approach was built, or it is the result of the, it was built under the assumption that by limiting the mixing of different land uses, then living conditions and working conditions would improve. For example, in a sense, it does sort of click. It does sort of make sense, because if you have, say, a heavy industrial estate mixed in with residential areas, then you might have issues there. And the prescriptive approach basically regulates development by placing similar uses in one zone and placing substantially different uses in another. And what is interesting to note here, that zoning emerged as a planning response to the need for improving urban areas. At some point, as there are so many criticism towards prescriptive land use planning or conventional zoning, um, performance-based planning approach or performance-based approaches emerged. Um, Performance-based planning emerged as a reaction to the rigidity of zoning regulations. Rather than taking a cookie cutter approach or a cookie cutter um, or a pizza cutter approach to planning, um, performance-based planning regulates developmental impact, not the land use itself, but it focuses more on the impact of development. And it does so using predetermined performance standards. And it also stems from the concept of carrying capacity that Fredlin, Gottschalk, and Parker suggested, that there is a finite amount of land carrying capacity or environmental carrying capacity, and that's what we need to control. It's not a matter of what you do on the land, but it's regulating what you can do, if that makes sense. The acceptable limits are defined in a set of performance indicators. So it's a more technical approach, I suppose, compared to prescriptive planning, compared to zoning. And so that brings me to this comparison of approaches. Now, zoning is as easy as taking a pizza cutter to cut or to slice a pizza into 8 pieces. It's as easy as that. It is very simple to administer, and as you cut the pizza, you get a tangible appearance of what it's going to look like as you cut it. If you cut it the conventional way, all the pizzas are going to look like triangles. And so that's two of the things, or two of the pros, or the advantages of zoning. It's really easy to administer. It's very simple, and you can see what the plan is going to look like in the future. However, with the pros, then there are cons or disadvantages. It is inflexible. It's not a very flexible system. Once you designate an area for residential development, for residential zones, then if you were going to change, if you need to change it in the future, then you need to do a rezoning and so on. And the second disadvantage is what I mentioned as the trigger to the emergence of performance-based planning, is that it is an ineffective tool for environmental protection. And the third one is an arguable, is a debatable disadvantage. It stifles creativity. Once this zone is designated as residential, low, medium, or high density residential, then it stays that way. You can't really do much to alter it. Now, performance-based approach promises improved environmental protection and management. It promises greater flexibility in that it anticipates future developments better. However, because of its nature, that it's flexible, that it relies on performance indicators, there's a bit of intricacy in the implementation. It requires a lot of technical knowledge. It requires a lot of technical capacity that most municipalities don't have at their disposal. And another drawback is, contrary to zoning, a performance-based approach does not have a tangible appearance for future development. You can't really see this is going to be a residential area, this is going to be industrial, this is going to be commercial, and so on, because it doesn't designate zones. It looks at a piece of land, it looks at an area, and then it assesses how much is its carrying capacity, and then in a performance-based approach, it would then you would then assess, oh, okay, I can, or this area can be developed into, say, 10% industrial, 30% commercial, and the rest is for residential, and conservation areas. And then in the next plot of land next to it, the composition would change, the development intensity would change, because the carrying capacity may be totally different. So each area or each plot of land requires a lot of thought, requires a greater amount of technical knowledge compared to zoning. So those are the pros, those are the pluses and the drawbacks of each approach. Which one is better? I can't really say. I think both. I think both have their own strengths. So coming back to our own regulatory, or our own spatial planning framework. This is a land use planning a unit, so we're not going to worry too much. We're not going to worry too much about regulation or pembinaan itu apa ya, and we're not going to worry too much about pengawasan either. In this unit, we'll focus more on the application of things, pelaksanaan, and how land use is planned, how a plot of land is utilized, and how it is controlled. And as you can see here, there are several mechanisms of control through land permit, through the issuing of land permits or usage permits, through incentives and disincentive mechanisms, and through penalties. And what determines whether it's going to be a green, a yellow, or a red is the zoning regulation. And I guess from upon seeing this word, you can already tell that we do take a very conventional approach to planning. We use zoning. Okay. Now, one of the many products that come out of our spatial decision-making processes is the zoning regulation, as I mentioned before. The zoning regulation is part and parcel to the detailed spatial plan, or RPTR. Now, the document, zoning regulation, is governed by two planning acts, or two acts, the 2007 Act and a peraturan pemerintah, and a governmental regulation, peraturan pemerintah number 15 2010. And the zoning regulation and our zoning regulation has two basic principles. That the first principle is that a planned area is to be divided into zones of various sizes, and that the same regulation apply to the same zones. Now, although what's funny is that although the Planning Act of 2007 states that there are three basic functions, as you see here. The first function is sebagai perangkat pengendalian pemanfaatan ruang. The second one is pedoman pengendalian pemanfaatan ruang, and the third one is dasar dalam pengendalian pemanfaatan ruang. Although it states that there are three basic functions of the zoning regulation, I can't help but think that there is only one keyword in this regulation, and the keyword is control. So zoning regulation is basically to control development. Now, another thing to note is that our planning authorities do acknowledge that zoning has its shortcomings, but they continue to use it because they believe that it can help achieve and maintain the quality of development and planning units. Another reason zoning is maintained as the planning tool of choice is because authorities also believe that by minimizing the mixing of different land uses, certain qualities, or better living qualities or better working qualities can be maintained. It's a very textbook expectations or an understanding of how zoning works, and by minimizing the mix of different functions and land uses, they also believe to be able to minimize the disturbance or negative impacts that may arise from the friction of two different land uses. And as I mentioned, they acknowledge that zoning is not flexible, and as a result, and because zoning does not really anticipate future situations very well, rezoning requests or requests for rezoning happens quite often. Okay. Now, let's have a look at the zoning regulation process. The zoning regulation process involves a number of steps. If you look at the first step, zoning or land use classification, and if you notice that zoning is done at the municipal level, you might think that, okay, land use classification is done at the municipal level. However, the classifications don't come, don't appear on its own. The land use classifications actually come from a ministerial decree, Peraturan Menteri Agraria dan Tata Ruang, or Badan Pertanahan Negara, ATR BPN. So the classifications themselves, they come from this ministerial decree. So it doesn't really come from the municipal government. So I think it is safe to say that in Indonesia, land use classification is done by the central government at the ministerial level. However, what you should note is that the designation of zones within the municipality is carried out by the city or by the Regency administration. So that's where the central government backs off. They've provided the guidelines, they provided the classification, they provided the tools. It is up to the provincial and the local governments to implement those tools and use them and use them to develop their own their own territories. So just to re-highlight the different zones and sub-zone classifications, there are oh, sorry, I'm sorry. Sorry about that disturbance. Iklan lewat. Where was I? Right. If you have a look at the ministerial decree, you will find zone and subzone classifications for both conservation area and areas of cultivation, or zona kawasan lindung dan zona kawasan budidaya. Here you can see that the conservation areas are divided into 4 categories: hutan lindung, and I'm not really sure how to translate the second one, subzona perlindungan terhadap kawasan bawahannya, and then zona perlindungan setempat and zona ruang terbuka hijau, or literally open green space. These are honestly, these are terms that are really difficult to to transfer to another language. But anyways, most of us should understand what they mean. And throughout this land use planning and development unit, we will dig into these classifications and sub-classifications a little further. And moving on to the cultivation areas, zona or kawasan budidaya, we have 7. I thought we had 8. Anyways, but there's residential, rumahan, there's commercial activities, perdagangan dan jasa. We have, and we split, or we separate commercial and offices for some reason. So there's perdagangan dan jasa and perkantoran. And we have sub-zone or zona industri, public services, or public services, sarana pelayanan umum, and then others, zona peruntukan lainnya and zona peruntukan campuran. So what's interesting is that from the 6th and 7th sub-classification or sub-zones, you can kind of see that they try to accommodate, they somehow try to accommodate a mixing of different land uses or different functions, but only up to a certain extent. So these zoning classifications are then taken onto a map, and the map product of that, the map is called it's called the zoning map. And but the zoning map can only tell so much. It doesn't really indicate the development intensity and other regulations that may come with the zoning map. So the zoning map is never a standalone product. There's a document that comes with the zoning map that is part and parcel of the zoning map, and it's called the zoning text. And that's where all the that's where all the performance indicators, I would say, are noted, are then explained. And hopefully, and I'm sure that as we progress through this unit, we will explore these zones and how we designate these zones onto an area. So there are a few references that are worthwhile reading. I can see that some of you mentioned that some of you have taken into books and reading. So during quarantine. So these are some references that you can check out that I've used to put together the course contents for today's session. And yeah, these are the references that I use to try and respond to my own questions. Some of these references are quite old, actually. Connor, Gottschalk, and Fredland. I have these references, and I will post them. In our classroom for you to access and read if you're interested. And I hope that answers some of the questions that I posted, or most of the questions that I posted a couple of weeks ago. I know that the land value issue, the land value questions have not been answered 100%, because I'd like to leave that for us to discuss at another session, because it's a really interesting topic to get into. Hopefully next week we can get into that a little bit further. So before I move on, if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and fire away.
Good morning, Mr. Nanda.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I just want to take you back a little quick on land use classification. I had a terrible signal. I guess I didn't understand your explanation when you were explaining. So is it the central or the municipal?
Okay. In short, the land use classifications, the land use classification is determined by the central government, because the classifications that you see, hang on this slide, and the next slide. So this is the classifications and the sub-classifications for the conservation areas. And these are the classifications and sub-classifications or subzones for the cultivation or budidaya, the developable areas, or areas for development, sorry. And all of these, and both the classifications and sub-classifications are done at the ministerial level, by the Ministry of Spatial Planning and Land Affairs. I'm not sure if I translated that accurately. I'll have to look into that. But yes, so in short, it is done. It is the zoning classifications are done at the central by the central government. However, the designation of zones within a territory, so whether the northern part of a territory will be industrial, and the southern part will be residential, and the central part of the territory would be for commercial and offices. That is entirely up to the municipal level. And so I'm guessing if I look back into the responses that I received, that that the majority of you responded to the question by saying that the classification should be done at the municipal level. I think that some of you may be thinking, well, shouldn't it be up to the local governments to determine whether that plot of land is residential, and that plot of land is industrial, that plot of land is commercial, and so on and so forth? Well, in that sense, yes, they're the ones who determine that is what. But the naming and the terminology and the divisions and subdivisions or the categories, they all come from the central government. The only reason I can see that they do that is because well, I'm sure any other country is is always, if you're talking at a country scale, it's always a big scale of planning. And Indonesia with this, because Indonesia is an archipelago, 17,000 islands. We need to use a uniform or a set of classifications that can be understood by people from the furthest east to the furthest west. And I'm sure that any other nations would do the same. Classification and grouping determined by the central government, and then the municipal levels would then translate them into their spatial plans. I don't know how they do. How do they do things back home, Peter?
I'm not really sure, because our thing there is not really advanced like the way it is here, because I don't know many people who have started this program in my country. So I guess here there's more material and more to learn about urban and regional planning, about land use, and about many things about this program.
Oops. But I see. I also see a lot of. Publications in planning. And because I have an interest in housing and settlement. I see a lot of novel approaches, and really a lot of publications, a lot of articles, generally a lot of things coming out from Africa. So I'm sure that they're doing something right there. They're doing something awesome there. It would be a shame if we didn't if we didn't try to learn from there. I'm sure that you guys are doing something really awesome there. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think something is being done, but maybe I haven't yet researched, because most of the material or the data I find is from South Africa,
I
because
see.
those guys are really doing so well in terms of this. So about my country, I don't really know exactly. I need to dig deeper because it's not many people who are into this. And you know, when a few people are into this, it's hard to find um, the sources. It's hard to find the materials because people are not publishing. You see, but if a quite number of people are publishing, it's easy to have information, and such that when I just Google something, I can easily find the information. But now I don't really know unless if I start contacting the councils where they have urban planners, and you know it's not an easy thing. So unless if I do that, I can get some information. And the other thing is, I think this is the challenge. Back home, some of these things, they don't usually post them. I don't know why. I think we need to learn from what other countries are doing by posting, let the public know, let the public have uh, accessibility,
Ac-
access to the information about these things. That way it's gonna make the people know. But now I don't know, I don't have any information. How am I supposed to know? It's so hard. So I think we can do better. We can try to emulate what other people are doing in other countries. So I think that's it.
Right. Well, um, I think in terms of transparency, Indonesia has come a long way. It used to not be this transparent, and even today, if you were to look for, or if you were to gain access to certain documents, um, then the department in charge may be a bit reluctant. I think one of my colleagues told me that, well, if all the documents were made public, I'm sure there's going to be a spike in class action and lawsuits here and there. And
Yeah.
I think a part of that, and I think a part of that culture is reflected when I mentioned about how the zoning regulation serves three basic functions, and those three basic functions are control, control, and control. So you can kind of see, and this came from the 2007 Planning Act, which if you notice that is uh, is a is almost is 10 years after the 10 years after the Asian financial crisis, 9 years after the rioting and the rebellion against Indonesia's New Order regime. And during the New Order era, everything is very tightly controlled, and this is even 10 years after that, and they're still talking about control, control, control. So yeah, we're not exactly letting we're not exactly letting everything publishing everything. I think it's because of that.
Yeah, because I was also wondering if maybe we could have the earlier version, because this one is 2007. Probably they must have the latest version, right?
Until now, the 2007 Act is still in effect. It's still in use. Um, as far as I know, other nations are also very similar to this. Australia still, at least Queensland, still uses the 2009 Act until today. So we're using the 2007 regulation. It's fine, I suppose, but we have something new coming, and that's the omnibus law. I'm not gonna delve into that because that's a whole different can of worms. Um, I don't fully understand the product at the moment, and judging by the way our House of Representatives are, um, judging by the judging by our House of Representatives' attitude towards the publication of the law, they said that no, it didn't come through us. No, we didn't have anything to do with it. It's like everybody's like, well, here's the document. That's it. We want to wash our hands now. Bye bye. That's the kind of attitude that we're seeing, and
Oh,
it's very unfortunate. Um,
really?
I think it's very unfortunate because if we were to discuss the contents of the document that is relevant to, at least that is the ones that are relevant to us as planners, I'm sure that we can come up with a fruitful discussion. We don't really need that kind of, I don't want to touch that anymore. We don't really need that kind of attitude. Granted, it's a very thick document. I think Pak Rudi, Pak Aris have been in several discussions, have engaged in several discussions regarding the law, but that was before um, that was before the law or the law was that was before the law was published. I'll post the link to the YouTube videos that to the YouTube videos that we made, uh, the recording of those discussion sessions. Unfortunately, it was conducted in Indonesian, of course, but um, yeah, but it was still a very interesting discussion nevertheless, because um, the new regulation states that oh, we don't need environmental feasibility studies anymore. So that's one aspect that we were kind of worried about. Wait, so for the sake of economic development, we are willing to sacrifice our environmental integrity. Are we actually willing to do that? Are we really going to do that? So that's from the planning perspective. I don't know much about the law from other perspectives. I need to get my hands on a copy of it as well, to have a read through and everything. It seems the labor side of the law has generated a lot of heat and generated a lot of tension. I don't want to delve into that. That's not my cup of tea. So yeah, a new regulation may be coming up, but I'm not really sure if it's for the better at the moment. Anybody else would like to share their thoughts and opinions? If you've picked up a book, or if you've picked up reading as a hobby during quarantine, I'm sure you've read some, and you said that you've read something interesting. Hopefully, you've read something that is relevant to the course. Otherwise, I'll just give you guys a bunch of books and articles to read. Okay. Anybody else care to share their opinion? If you have something to say about omnibus, you can say so. It's fine. This is let's just call this a neutral ground. Um, it's a neutral ground for academic discussion. If you have something to say about anything with regards to zoning regulations, please do say so.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
I'm not going to tell an opinion, but more like asking a question. Is that
Sure.
okay?
Absolutely.
So, uh, about the certain types of zone that
Mhm.
is able in Indonesia, I'm still confused about the difference between prescriptive and also performance. I mean, when a government determines a land to be a certain zone, isn't it based on the advantages and also the disadvantages of some certain land and also the characteristics?
Okay. That's a good one. That's a good one. I asked a similar thing. I asked a similar thing to my supervisor a few years ago when she proposed that I should highlight the differences between a prescriptive approach and a performance-based approach. Um, at first, initially I said to her, um, "Isn't it all the same thing? In the end, you're prescribing something, whether it be a zone or a performance indicator. You're prescribing something in the end." And well, what she said was one of the key things with zoning is that you are looking at the current condition. So you're looking at the area as is at the moment. You're looking at its you're looking um, at its physical properties, slope, the type of soil, what can grow on it, what you can grow on it, what you can't grow on it. You're looking at if there are people, if there are settlements on it at that time, then you're looking at what they do, how they are, that you're looking at their culture, you're looking at their habits, you're looking at their behavior at that moment. And then you take all of that, you take the physical aspects of the area, you take the cultural aspects of the area, maybe you add in a little, maybe you add in economical aspects and everything, and then you determine the land use, a suitable land use for that plot of land at that time as um, as farmlands, for example. Or this should be an area of this should be an area of cultivation, and you should plant corn there or something, um, based on the potential that is seen at that moment. A performance-based approach, on the other hand, would have a look and say, okay, we have these physical traits here. We have um, we have the we have these sociological traits on the other hand, and then let's have a look at the history of the place. Uh, then they take back, okay, what's been going on for the last few years, for the last few decades, and then they project what's going to go on in the future. And by those projections, they may think, or they may find out that, okay, it's good for farmland and pasture at the moment, but in 25 years time, it's got to change. It's got to change. And maybe, well, some parts of it are good for this and other parts aren't. And so what a performance-based approach would do is, we're not going to designate this plot of land as industrial. All of it should be industrial. No, well, maybe it can be used for industrial purposes, but only for light industrial purposes, because it doesn't have the carrying capacity. Um, it doesn't have the carrying capacity for heavy industry or intense industrial use. for intense development and so on. And if anything changes, if somehow, industrial activities such as manufacture or whatnot is no longer profitable. Let's change it to something else. Okay, change it to commercial activities. Okay, fine, change it to commercial activities. But what you're doing is, or what you would do is, in a performance-based approach is, what sort of commercial activity are we going to do here? We should remember that this area has only a certain amount of carrying capacity. Or we'll do light commercial, or maybe a combination of commercial and residential. So rather than giving, this should be, rather than explicitly saying that this should be heavy industry, a performance-based as a prescriptive planning approach would do, this should be heavy industry, this should be this should be that, and putting them into boxes or boxes or putting them into boxes or categories. The performance base is more flexible in terms of, well, yeah, you can do that, you can do this, you can do that, as long as you do not, as long as you don't exceed the predetermined environmental carrying capacity, as long as you don't, for example, yeah, you can do commercial, yeah, you can do industrial, but you should keep your noise level to a minimum. If you can't do that, go somewhere else, that sort of thing. Or if you can't, if you currently cannot conform to the performance indicators that we ask, that you should fulfill this, and this, then we ask you to adjust your practices. We ask you to. So rather than looking at a piece of area or looking at a territory and thinking, oh, I can do all these many things with it. A performance-based approach would look at a territory and say, well, okay, what can we do here that is not going to change, the area much, that sort of thing, in line with the carrying capacity concept, I suppose. And yeah, it doesn't specify land use. It is more concerned with the impact of what is going to happen there. So I guess that's how we can differentiate between these two approaches. I can't really say which one is better than which, but there is a fundamental difference to the way things are done. But in the end, you get a planning document and you get a list of things. As I mentioned before, if you're in Indonesia, we use zoning, but the zoning map itself is not a standalone product. It's got a zoning text, and this zoning text, if you look at it, if you look through it, it may sound a lot like performance indicators, as you would find in a purely performance-based approach. There are a few cities that inadvertently use performance-based planning. They initially went with zoning, but then as they go along, rezoning this, rezoning that, then they accidentally switched to a more performance-based approach. I think Toronto is one example. I know Queensland in Australia is an accidental, or they accidentally switched to performance-based planning. They would say that, no, we are formally using a prescriptive planning but in practice, they are actually using performance-based. So sometimes in practice, these things can get blurry. I think we need to keep an open mind to things like this in practice. That yes, there are some drawbacks to prescriptive approaches. It's not flexible. It's not very flexible. Changing the color of a zone is a pain. Here, I know one case. I know one case near near where I live, where a church was going to provide childcare services as well. And what happened was, well, you are currently a pink zone or a house of worship or pink zone because you're a house of worship. And if you want to provide childcare services, then you are changing your zone color to yellow. And that requires a huge amount of paper. And I thought, yeah, well, this is one of the drawbacks of zoning, I suppose. And yet, Queensland is one of the states in Australia that uses a hybrid of, like I said, it was they accidentally stumbled or they accidentally switched to a performance-based approach, but they're still using a very prescriptive approach to administering their land uses. Oh, I ramble on and on. I'll check them out. But I hope that answers your question of the differences of prescriptive and performance-based planning.
Yes, sir. So
Sort of. Yes.
when the government determine about the certain zone, is it able to change like in future time? Because like as time goes by, the condition of some land will change, right? I mean, is it possible for the government to switch the zone to be another zone, like says the industrial zone to be, I don't know, like agricultural or something?
Yeah, and
Yep.
just to add on from her question, and what are the repercussions if you just change without informing the relevant authorities?
You know what? Changing without informing the relevant authorities is something that we do best here. We do a lot of that. But in short, can you change the zone from one zone to another? In short, the answer is yes. You can request for a zoning change, and that here. I'm not quite sure how it's done administratively and technically, but if you want to change from one color to another, you can at some point in time. Whether people do it illegally, it is not uncommon to find here. As much as it is uncommon to find regular houses turned into offices. And then regular or single family dwellings, turned into multiple family dwellings, kos-kosan, for example. That in itself should actually, you really should inform the authorities when you do that. But in practice, I think it's a more lax approach to it. We have a document called the built environment and building plans, RTBL, Rencana Tata Bangunan dan Lingkungan. And that document details the building setback, the building height, and the floor area ratio, and so on. But in essence, that document gives you a guideline of how intensely can you build on your property or on your territory. But do people follow that? Some do, some don't, and guess what? They still and most of the times, I'm gonna tread lightly now, but most of the times they get away with it, and they receive a building permit anyways. So we're still lost. I think in terms of these, in terms of regulations and law enforcement, we still have a long way to go, especially in the built environment and spatial aspects. But I think that's at a very micro scale. So 1 or 2 parcels of land that we're talking about. But on a broader scale, at the municipal level, at the provincial level, I think we're pretty complacent. That I think we've done. I think we've regulated and we've enforced the regulations pretty well. If there were any deviations, if there were anybody breaking the rules, and I think we have already taken very strict measures to deal with those parties. Yeah, some aspects I think work well. We can change the zones. Coming back to the initial question, we can change the zones. But there is an extensive process in doing so. And in terms of whether people should report their development activities, they should, and I underline should. But do they do it? I would say not always. Not unless it's an in your face kind of thing, where it is clearly visible by the general population. It's clearly visible by authorities. Like if you put up a billboard at your house, then yeah, you definitely, and you try to get away with that. Good luck. But yeah, it's got to be really visible. Any other thoughts or comments?
And the repercussions?
Repercussions. Sorry, the repercussions to what?
If you violate the law, for example, you had a residential, and then you alter it to a commercial. Okay. So do you have any repercussion on that?
We have the incentive, disincentive, and the penal and the penal and the penalties. Sorry, but how far are these incentives, disincentives, and the penalties are enforced? I can't really say. I dare say that court cases regarding or court cases dealing with land use and spatial planning issues are not very widely publicized. Um, I had this idea once that I should take you guys, all of you, to court someday and see if there are any land use issues that are being disputed, that have been taken to court. I'd really love to be able to take you guys there, and so that you can see the process, the trial process and everything. But unfortunately, as far as my lawyer friends, as far as my lawyer friends have informed me, such cases aren't really that common. So I don't really know how it is, how these two mechanisms, the incentive, the disincentive, and the penalty measures are applied on site, on ground zero, so to say, on the ground. But yeah, fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. We can come up. We can find a court case that that discusses, or that highlights land use issues. I think that would be really, really interesting. It would be a really, really great learning opportunity for all of us. So repercussions, I'm sure there are repercussions. Just how far will that affect someone's business or someone's reputation? I can't really say. Maybe Pak Rudy will. Maybe Pak Rudy can have a few words on that. I've noted it down on the recording. So yeah, we should have a further discussion on that. Any more questions?
I want to ask, sir.
So sure.
We all know the term ruko, right?
Yeah.
Ruko is like rumah toko, literally rumah in the second level, and then toko in the first level. And then maybe the term ruko now is now only the commercial buildings, but in the past the ruko is really used as a house and a shop. And how do the classifications really classify that? Like, is it count as a residential area, or is now only commercial, sir?
Okay. That's an interesting. The shop house concept is an interesting one to look at, because now I think shop houses, or ruko, we can forget about the ru or the rumah. We just focus on the ko or the toko, because most of the times they're not used as a residential or as a dwelling facility. It's become purely commercial, whether the first level, second, and the third, or first, second, and third levels, they're usually purely commercial. First of all, I think I'm not sure if I'm not sure which classification they fall into. It's clearly a combination of so it's clearly a combination of 1 and 2, residential or housing and commercial. It can also bleed into zone 3, office use. Perhaps ideally, if you talk about shop houses, then it could either fall into category 6 or 7. I think it's a good piece of research, small research that we could do. Which classification does a ruko fall into? If you look at the history of shop houses, I think they reached their height of popularity sometime sometime in the late 1980s to the up until the late 90s, maybe. Um, Shop houses were just popping up, were popping up almost everywhere, and I think even then, um, even then, people were not really using them um, as a shop and a house. People were just using them for business activities. That's as far as my observation goes. I don't really know. I don't know how. To be honest, I don't know how the regulations were back then, but it did generate a lot of controversy. At least in Surabaya, there was a lot of friction. Um, there was a lot of friction in that in that sense, because all of a sudden people were like, "Why are we building all these shop houses? Why are all these shop houses suddenly popping up?" Um, there were even like one or two houses, one or two parcels of land that had houses, individual houses on them, and then those two houses were demolished, and then they built up, and then people would erect two or three shop houses and sell them, and those shop houses are located smack dab in the middle of a in the middle of a densely populated residential area or kampungs. Those practices were very common back then. Maybe there are still some now. I think that's I think that's something worthwhile to look at. But as for which category do shop houses fall into, I think nowadays I can safely say that they would fall into categories two and or three. But thank you for that question. I feel like going through some zoning text documents now because of that. It is an interesting thing to look at. Maybe we can maybe I'll look into that. You can look into it as well, and then we can compare what we find out in our next session. I hope that answers
Thank
that.
you, sir. And
Nice.
I think there's a last question from me.
Sure.
I'm just wondering why do you separate the accessibility and the distance in the factors that affecting lane value? Why don't you just include the distance in the accessibility part?
Why do I separate accessibility and distance? I think it comes down to how I or how Pak Ardi and I define accessibility. We define accessibility as having infrastructure that allows access to a certain area. For example, in our research, because we focused on residential developments, we were thinking of how accessible these developments were, and so we found that the more accessible the development, the more accessible the development, the higher its property value. So the more roads that go there, the more roads, the more public transit lines that go there. Although in Surabaya, there's not that's not the case public transit line wise, but just to illustrate, so more roads that lead to that area, the size of the road, the volume of traffic, and other infrastructure or other facilities that allow people to access um, the development to access it physically, that determines its property value. Whereas distance, we define distance as the distance between the development and other functions such as healthcare, education, commercial activities, and recreational facilities, and so forth. So if you talk in units, that's a whole different thing. How can you measure accessibility? Well, you look at the number of roads, you look at the network infrastructure, you look at the, just you look at the number of roads and network infrastructure that allows you to access the place. Whereas distance, you measure in meters, kilometers, how far is it, and how much time does it take for you to go from A to B, that sort of thing. So that's the reason why we separated distance and accessibility. It was because by definition it was two different things. Although distance may influence or may impact accessibility, the further away it is the further away development is from a certain type of function, then that would make it inaccessible. Or the further away it is from other centers of development, makes it almost inaccessible, or make it less inaccessible compared to when it's closer to other developments, and so on and so forth. So thank you for bringing that up. I would say accessibility and distance are two variables that can be considered as two separate variables, two variables that are independent of each other, or you can consider them as two variables that are somehow codependent. For example, accessibility is dependent on distance, and yeah, so that means that distance would be the independent variable and accessibility would be the dependent variable depending on the distance. So it really depends on how you look at it. But for this, for the purpose of this research that Arti and I did in 2011, I think it was in 2011, a long time ago, we decided to separate those two variables.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
No worries. Any more questions?
I want to ask, sir.
Sure.
I would like to ask your opinion on using the super block concept. Like in the land, there is apartment, there is mall, there is ruko, and other things. Is it effective in utilizing the land use?
Super blocks. Super blocks are an interesting concept. I think they've been around. The super block concept has been around for quite some time, but it's only been catching on. It's only been catching on here in the last couple of decades. And if you're talking about maximizing land value or maximizing your return on investment, in that sense, a super block would make sense because you have a parcel of land, and you don't want to, and you'd like to, of course, you'd like to be able to capitalize as much as you can from that piece of land, and so a super block makes sense because one, you're presenting a mixed use development. In at least you have commercial activities going on there, and at least you have and then you also have residential purposes or residential structures there, and you can and you can capitalize on at least these two functions. You can sell the units, or you can rent them out. You can sell or rent out the shops or the stalls to tenants. And so you're in effect, a super block tries to maximize profit gain. And I think per square meter area, it's a really good idea. It's a from a commercial or from a marketing or from an economic standpoint, that's an awesome thing to do. Who wouldn't want a super block? But if you look at it from development intensity, you are a super block would in effect be a very big and a very heavy sort of development. It would try to maximize the intensity of use, the usage intensity of a parcel of land. So maybe from an environmental standpoint, it's not so desirable, and maybe from a social perspective, it may also not be that desirable. Maybe that's open for debate, of course. If you look at in Surabaya, at least, Tunjungan, the Tunjungan Plaza area, how it's now interconnected as a it is essentially a super block now. It used to be just that one shopping center, Tunjungan Plaza, TP1. It was just that, and then it grew, to two structures, and then the third one came, and then the fourth one came, and it became this sprawling development, not only horizontally but also vertically now, with the hotel and stuff. Maybe that is, and then if you compare that development, if you compare that super block to the properties surrounding it, highly densely populated kampong areas, where most of the staff who work in Tunjungan live, or get access to cheap food and everything. Maybe from the social standpoint, that the visibility of an economical gap is also not so desirable. So a super block, I would say, like all other things, it can be good, it can be, I wouldn't say bad. It can be good, it can be undesirable. It really depends on which standpoint you're looking at, which perspective, or which lens are you looking at it from. For me personally, it would make sense. It would make sense up to a certain point, but seeing a super block right next to a slum area, that I wouldn't want that. I really wouldn't want that to happen. Although I think it may have happened. It might have happened in some places here, and it is very, very. It is, for me personally, it is very undesirable to see such a huge gap being presented right in front of us. So yeah, it can be a good thing. It can be a bad thing. I'm not entirely on the it's all good. I'm not entirely on the it's all good side. I'm also not entirely on the it's all bad side. I may be leaning towards the undesirable undesirable side, because I do believe that super blocks have the potential to take away business from local and small scale business owners. That's my take on it.
I see. Thank you, sir.
No worries. Anybody else? Would anybody else care to ask or share their opinion? If not, then it's almost 2 hours already, and I think that during this session we've had quite a fruitful discussion. Although there are still some questions that remain to be answered. I think hopefully we can find out the answers as we progress throughout this unit, throughout the semester. And for me, I am sincerely happy to be able to see you all again, so to say. It's good to see. It's great to see you guys in the videos that you sent. I think you can look forward to actually having more of those recorded sessions, because as we go along, I've decided to not do live presentation sessions due to many things, namely because sometimes during live sessions, one of the group members would have poor connectivity, poor signal, and that would hinder them from presenting and so on and so forth. So I think a recorded session for this kind of situation would work better at the moment. For group or individual presentations. Again, thank you very much for your responses. I'm sorry I couldn't respond to them individually. I wish that I could. I really would have loved to be able to respond to all of you individually. And once again, it's good to see you all again. Thank you for attending the session. I will post the recording of our session in Classroom, and I look forward to seeing you all again next week. So, thank you very much and have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Thank you,
sir.
sir. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, stay safe and stay healthy, and ending the session in 3, 2,